What do you make so far of the dominant narrative we're getting here in the US that militarily that this has been a disaster for Russia, that Ukraine is putting up fierce resistance that Putin
Mhm.
did not expect and has inflicted serious military defeat on the Russian invaders?
Well, as to the last point, it's very obvious that what Ukrainian forces are still active are entirely surrounded, cut off, and isolated in various towns and cities. The Ukrainian forces are incapable of anything but an occasional pinprick attack on something that doesn't appear to be very robust or dangerous. So the war, for all intents and purposes, has been decided. The issue for the Russians from the very beginning has been how do we proceed without killing large numbers of civilians and inflicting a lot of property damage? And Putin gave very strict orders from the outset that they were to avoid these things. The problem with avoiding it is that it has slowed the progress of the operation to the point where it has given false hope both to the Ukrainians, but I think has been seized on by people in the West to try and convince the world that a defeat is in progress when in fact the opposite is the case. So the war itself at this stage of the game could be decided very, very rapidly, uh, permanently, if Putin were to give the order and allow the forces to disregard the concern for civilians and property damage. But he hasn't done that. He has continued to negotiate, even though he recognizes that the people sitting across from him really are not in a position to deliver very much. They're being told what to do. And it's very obvious that Washington wants this to continue as long as possible in the hopes that Russia will be desperately harmed. I just don't see that happening. This morning, the latest polling data was given to me from eastern Poland about Russia, and 70% of the Russian population is firmly behind Vladimir Putin. That's a very large percentage in any conflict for any president to enjoy.
And that's
His
up almost
forces have
10%.
allegedly lost 2,000 dead. I have no way of confirming that. Nobody else does. That may well be the case, but out of 200,000 forces, 200,000 troops, that's not an unreasonable amount for 3 weeks of fighting. The thousands of Ukrainians who've been killed, soldiers, is anyone's guess because obviously Kiev isn't going to report that honestly. We're going to get inflated figures for their opponents and untrue figures for themselves. So I think the big problem right now is that in the West, there is no truth. There is wishful thinking, and there is this impression of success by the Ukrainians that doesn't stack up. In fact, the Russians are capturing large quantities of Western equipment, British and American, that are being shipped to them at this point.
Yeah, we have a map from South Front, which I think might be more accurate than the Kagan's think tank, the Institute for the Study of War.
Yeah.
Right to your left, I'm not sure if you see it on screen, but as
Yes.
you see, the red marks Russian positions, the Russian incursion, and if you look to the north of Ukraine, just north of Kiev, you can see Russia forming positions around Kiev and essentially encircling. That's my view, encircling divisions of the Ukrainian military. And then in the east, there's a rapid advance, not only of Russian forces, but forces from Lugansk and Donetsk, who are technically, according to the U.S., Ukrainian. And you can see pockets there, which I would call cauldrons. Can you give us an assessment based on what you see of this map as of March 14th?
Well, on the southeastern side, towards the bottom, you have as many as 60,000 Ukrainian troops that are completely surrounded in what the Russians are referring to as a cauldron. Uh, that's been going on for several days now. No one knows what the status of those forces is. They're probably running out of water, supplies, ammunition. The Russians would prefer that they surrender. Some have, but there may be pressure now to end this, which would result in the mass slaughter of some 60,000 troops. And I don't think the Russians are interested in that. I think what the Russians are interested in is what you see. They've gone to the large population centers. They've tried to avoid the central portion of Ukraine because that's the agricultural area. In fact, Russian troops have been told to stay out of the fields. The Russians realize that we're on the verge of spring planting in Ukraine. They're not interested in destroying the wheat and barley crops at all. They would prefer to see that go ahead. So the issue for the Russians right now is that everything worth controlling is controlled. This notion that you hear over and over and over again on television, well, they haven't increased their territorial control. They're not interested in territory. The entire operation from day one was focused on the destruction of Ukrainian forces. That's largely complete with the exception of those that are still surrounded. They've got a huge problem in Mariupol, which is off to the right, where you have roughly 3,000 of these fanatical fighters in the Azov regiment or battalion, whatever you want to call it, who are refusing to allow any of the civilians in the city to leave. In fact, I saw footage this morning of these Ukrainian Azov troops telling the population there, you can't leave, even though the Russians had opened a corridor for humanitarian assistance and evacuation. Again, these things are not reported in the West because it tends to damage the narrative. So my great concern is the determination to annihilate the Azov crowd could result in real destruction in Mariupol, which would be terrible for the people there. But again, one doesn't know what the thinking is at higher levels. I suspect there's a desire to end this, get this over with. But as long as Zelensky stalls, the more Ukrainian forces will be killed. And it doesn't make any difference how much we try to ship into Ukraine. They can't assimilate it and use it effectively in any case at this point. But again, this satisfies the narrative that the Russians are losing. Putin is evil and must be driven out, and he's the aggressor. All of the information going back to 2014 and earlier is essentially deleted from the discussion. The fact that they've lost 14,000 people killed in the war since 2014 that the Ukrainians have waged relentlessly against the Russians in the East, that's ignored. So it's very tragic, but I think what will happen is the truth will out. Eventually, this will end. The Russians will be successful in what they've set out to do, and the Ukrainians will be destroyed. I'd rather not see that. I don't think Putin wants to see that. Remember, he's fighting against people that he largely considers to be very much like himself. There is no desire to murder all of these people, contrary to popular belief. The biggest lie I've heard repeated on television is Russian troops have been told to deliberately murder civilians, Ukrainian civilians. It's absurd. It's nonsense. Nothing could be further from the truth. Do they make mistakes? Do munitions fall on things they'd rather not? Of course, we make those mistakes. Every military organization does. But it is as ridiculous to assert that the Russians are deliberately murdering civilians as it was to assert when we were in Vietnam or then subsequently involved in other wars in the Middle East that we were deliberately murdering civilians. We were not. We didn't always tell the truth about it. In the sense when we made mistakes, we tried to dress it up. But the truth is we never set out to do those things. I don't see any evidence that they are doing it either. If they were, this would have been over 10 days ago.